Hello, welcome to another video discussing different ideas and potential thoughts on an inspector course. This one is about consent and implied consent within an inspector course, and I must thank Nikki Smith, who presented this at a recent CPD event. Very informative, lots of knowledge picked up and gained. Just to move away from the obvious capitalist socialist views, and it's something else that students can talk about within their essays. Okay, so why then do we think it's important? So for those of us living in the 21st century, it can be difficult to understand the social norms of the early 20th century. Now, when we're coming to write an essay, it's always good to look at various audience reactions. Okay, so in the early 20th century, the audience obviously would have reacted in a different way compared to the modern day audience. And you can see that with the change of values and obviously the movement forward of the values and ideals between people within society. Okay, marriage amongst the middle and upper class were seen as a business arrangement as much as a love match. Okay, now this again can be seen in Mr. Birling's eagerness to get the marriage done so that Crofts Limited and Birling and Company can work together for higher prices and lower costs. Okay, so this idea here of concept of double standards. Okay, men were almost expected to be sexually active and women were chaste until marriage. What does chaste mean? It means that they were pure, they were kept clean and innocent until marriage. Now again, you could argue that this is still stereotypically seen today. So if a man sleeps around, he's respected by his peers. But actually the opposite happens if a girl is sleeping around, and you could argue that the girl could sometimes get pushed away. Okay, this idea, the concept of being ruined as a woman who had engaged in sexual activity before marriage. This woman is now not pure, this woman is now not clean for her future husband. Okay, but is that true? I would argue it isn't, but you've got this concept of Eva Smith being ruined by Gerald, by Eric, and ultimately leading to her downfall and her suicide. Okay, you've also got this idea that men of upper and middle class had an expectation that working class women could provide them with a service for a limited time period. Okay, so again, you've got that expectation of that patriarchal society that the man is the head and actually the woman should be the obedient one, and the manipulation of the rich and powerful against the poor and weak. Okay, they've used Eva Smith. Once they've got bored with her, they've discarded her to the side and forgotten about her. She is being used, and she's provided them with the service for a limited amount of time. Okay, so as I mentioned in a previous video clip, you've got this idea that Mrs. Birling is presented as someone who is firmly rooted in the Victorian values of women should be obedient wives. Okay, now you look at that, we've got this quote here: when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. So, we're looking there. Mrs. Birling firmly believes that women should be obedient wives, and women should be just generally be obedient. Now, in terms of this, Sheila questions what Gerald was doing. Mrs. Birling completely refutes that and comes back with this. Okay, now as we know, Sheila was right to question Gerald, but actually because of Mrs. Birling's strong Victorian values that have been rooted, that have been instilled within her from her parents, she doesn't understand why Sheila is questioning this at all. Okay, so I went through this slide in the character PowerPoint. Again, it's just the idea that Mrs. Birling seems to have this lack of trust in women actually having a brain that they can think for themselves. So again, we've got this quote: "It's not true, Gerald, you must know, and you're a man." Okay, again, it shows that she prefers to take the word of someone who openly admits he sees very little of Eric. Okay, rather than listening to her daughter who sees Eric every day and is well aware of the drunk that he actually is. Because the woman cannot have the brain, the woman cannot have the idea and be right, but that is just those firm, deep-rooted Victorian values that are instilled within Mrs. Birling. Okay, so you've got the expectation as well that women are incredibly shallow. Okay, so Mr. Birling says, yes, but you've got to remember, my boy, that clothes mean something quite different to a woman, not just something to wear and not only something to make them look prettier, but well, a sort of sign or token of their self-respect. Okay, so it's showing there that if a woman is not wearing the smartest clothes, if they're looking a bit downbeat, then they don't see themselves as someone with a higher standing in society. Okay, it's their sign. They lack self-respect if they are not wearing the clothes that his family would wear, for example. Now, it's that expectation of the Edwardian society that actually these clothes meant a lot more to women than what they actually did. Okay, but Mr. Birling doesn't see that. Okay, but actually, you've got the inspector here as this voice of J.B. Priestley, this voice of social change. But actually, even the inspector is not immune to the concept. Okay, it seems she liked working there. It was a nice change from a factory. She enjoyed being among pretty clothes, I've no doubt. So again, we can see there that even the inspector he still has these ideas that actually the women are incredibly shallow. Okay, it's nice being from a factory and being around nice clothes. That's what he seems to think. Okay, so with all this in mind, is it any wonder that the men in the play assume the women in the play will consent to what they demand? Okay, so women are seen as shallow, they're incapable of discussing serious issues. So if we remember when Mr. Birling is having his business talk with Eric and Gerald, Mrs. Birling and Sheila are not there, okay, because they're not capable of discussing those serious issues. The men seem to think that the women are obsessed with clothing and the physical appearance. Okay, everybody in the play mentions Eva's good looks at some point. Okay, that she was a pretty girl. Okay, it shows that women are obedient to men, especially Mrs. Birling's deep-rooted Victorian values. Actually, though, Sheila, you could argue there's a playful warning to Gerald about what he was doing, you know, during the summer when he was away for a long time. Okay, so it shows again Sheila is that vehicle for change, that generational gap between her and her mother. Okay, now the women within the play, they're not shown of any importance. They're either shown as a wife, which is Mrs. Birling, a daughter, Sheila, worker, Eva Smith, Edna, or mistresses, again linking into Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, women of the town. Okay, so if we're talking about the consent then, Eva then is obviously the character to pinpoint when we look at or think about consent. So a concept that students can struggle with is whether or not Eric actually raped her. Now he does mention he was in that mood where a chap could easily turn nasty, but there's no specific mention whether or not Eva actually consented. Okay, so liken this to these modern experiences of online dating stories in the media about date rape expectations, and it becomes a little clearer. Is there the expectation that sex will occur? And is that what Eric thought, rather than actually Eva specifically consenting? Was it that there was an expectation that they would have intercourse? Okay, now it's, as we mentioned in that quote, I was in one of those moods when a chap threatens to turn nasty. It would indicate the threat of assault rather than actual force. Now we obviously know they engaged in intercourse because Eva Smith ended up pregnant. However, is the idea of explicit consent there, or is it more implied consent? Okay, so you could argue then that the class system is what ultimately causes Eva to consent. Eric threatened to make a row. So as I mentioned before in the character video, if there was a row, if there was an argument, and Eva's landlady would hear it, or landlord would hear it, it would actually be Eva who ended up evicted rather than Eric, who was in trouble for the assault. So you've got this idea that even the landlady, okay, if she heard Eva's distress, Eva's cries for help, she would seemingly have this agreement that she's implicitly consented to Eric and her engaging in sexual intercourse, because that was the expectation, and that class system what causes Eva to consent. So really, it was a lose-lose situation for Eva Smith at this point. Now, you've got Eva and Gerald, so nowhere is there any suggestion that Gerald would assault Eva, that Gerald did assault Eva. It wouldn't fit with his concept of himself as a knight in shining armour, but he still assumes consent. Okay, he didn't install her there to become his mistress, but he's unsurprised when she willingly consents to this. He's quite happy that she's offering herself to him. You know, he doesn't argue it against it. He doesn't think actually Sheila's at home. Okay, he's unsurprised because there's this implied consent and that class system, because that is just what was expected of the women at the time. Okay, so he's rescued her from one person assuming consent. Okay, so again, this idea of this implied consent, which was Alderman Megati, and has ruined her himself with little thought for the consequences. So with little thought for what effect it would have on Eva Smith, for little thought of the consequence of what it would have on Sheila, or the consequence of their relationship. Will their relationship last? Okay, so again, students often fail to understand the concept of Eva's ruination. Why should she be brought down by being in a sexual relationship outside marriage but not him? And again, it boils down to class and gender. So as we mentioned before, the working class, the lower class, it was just expected of them to provide these services for the upper class men. And if you watch some of the clips from Les Mis that I mentioned in the other video, you will see there that it's just the expectation of the women and what they were expected to do. And you've also again got this idea of gender, that the idea of a man to sleep around is seen as it's celebrated in his friendship group, where actually if a woman engages in intercourse before marriage, she seems to be ruined. She is now unclean, she is impure. Okay, now if you note as well that nobody in the family is really outraged by the fact that Gerald has been in a sexual relationship. They are only mildly outraged that he's cheated on Sheila, and even then they expect Sheila to understand and forgive him. Now, in modern times, you'd have this idea that someone's cheated on someone else, get rid of them. Yeah, they're not worth it, especially a family. Okay, so, people out there try to imagine that if you've been cheated on, would your parents expect you to understand and actually forgive that person who's cheated on you? Probably not now, but that is what was expected in Edwardian times, and especially more so expected of the woman of the family. Okay, so we've got Sheila then. Now, Eva isn't the only victim of implied consent within the play. Sheila is also constricted by gender roles and is expected to toe the line when faced with Gerald's actions. So again, touching on what we've just mentioned there about the Burling family expecting Sheila to forgive Gerald for what he has done. Okay, Sheila is expected to forgive and move forward with the marriage because of this idea of gender roles. Okay, so we've already got indications that she is expected to consent to Gerald's behaviour with Mrs. Burling's comment about important men being busy. Okay, so Mrs. Burling sees Gerald as being one of these important men, and actually it does not matter what they're doing because they're the important man. Mrs. Burling is on the belief that important men will be away for a long time on business, but actually, is she consenting there to her husband having an affair, or is there the implied consent because that is just what men do at the time? Okay, even though she says, and this is Sheila, I don't think I will get used to it, this is said half playfully, half seriously. Okay, now this shows that she lacks the courage to actually show a serious side on the issue. So Sheila is that vehicle for change, as we've mentioned before. You know, it's this generational gap, and it shows the potential that these young people can change for a better future. But actually, when she is being told about these important men and that they will be away for a long time, half playfully, half seriously, shows that she cannot fully understand, she cannot fully grasp the idea that he may be away for a long time, and she doesn't want to show that serious side. So again, it shows that Sheila is implicitly complying to Gerald being away. Okay, so important contextual points. So remember, in all your essays for literature, you need to be putting in AO3 points, your context points. There is a difference here between Mrs. Birling, who, as we've mentioned before, encompasses these classic Victorian values, and actually Sheila, who shows the early signs of the feminist movement in her very mild protest. Okay, yes, Mrs. Birling, we've agreed these Victorian values, that the wife is obedient towards their husband, and that is what the Victorian values are rooted within her, say. But Sheila, actually, being of this different generation and growing up in the Edwardian society, she shows these early signs of this social change, this feminist movement, by actually half seriously protesting against what Gerald is doing. Okay, also Mrs. Birling and indeed Mr. Birling expects obedience from their children and from women in general, again encompassing these Victorian values. And that is something, rather than just talking about the generational gap between the young versus old, talk about the values, the difference in values. So the children are growing up on these Edwardian values, whereas the parents, Mrs. Birling and Mr. Birling, were actually growing up during Victorian times, and these Victorian values have been drilled in, instilled upon them to actually have the obedient wife. Okay, so Sheila continued then. Sheila asked Gerald about her ring. Is it the one you wanted me to have? Okay, now again, it's this implication that she will accept both his proposal and his choice of jewellery by saying, is it the one you wanted me to have? So regardless of what ring it's going to be, regardless of how he's going to propose, she's going to accept it regardless, because again, it's those stereotypical gender roles that Sheila is constricted to, the roles that Sheila is confined to, and that she has to accept regardless of what piece of jewellery it is. Okay, so when faced with his infidelity, she is urged to understand, even though her father is not making excuses for him. Mr. Birling sees the marriage as a business proposition. So here you've got this idea that Mr. Birling isn't trying to make any excuses. He can't understand why he's done that. However, he does expect Sheila to understand what he's done, because for Mr. Birling, this marriage is a business deal. It is a business proposition which will ultimately allow Mr. Birling to have a higher footing in society, because him and the Crofts are now working in partnership with each other. Okay, now ultimately she is going to give in and consent. So despite her growth throughout the play, we've got this development of character changing again from immature to very mature, very insightful. When asked by a very confident Gerald, what about this ring, she replies with, not yet, it is too soon. Okay, so you've got this word yet, so you've got this idea that she is going to marry a known cheat because it's what she is expected to do. Okay, the rest of the characters expect her to consent to this marriage. So she doesn't come out with no, it is a not yet, it's too soon. Okay, so further down the line, they will get married. She just can't initially consent to it right at this moment in time, because she has still, as we mentioned before, this feminist movement. Yeah, she begins to show signs of this feminist movement, but actually she is then still now conforming to these gender roles, to these stereotypes of the obedient wife. Okay, so quick summary then to finish off. Implied consent in the play is created by these Victorian values to women, so it shows that women must be obedient and women are expected to do and fulfil their gender roles. The societal norms which dictate that men can be sexually active but women cannot. I think it's also an important note. That I'd agree that these societal norms are still in place. As I mentioned, if men are sexually active, they're celebrated by the peers, but actually if a woman is sexually active, then she is not, and she can be pushed away and shunned aside. Okay, then you've got this idea that women's own acceptance of their own positions. So again, you've got, go back to Eva Smith, she was in that desperate position of needing to, for want of a better phrase, sell her own body. She accepted that. She made no fuss of that, but again, you've got that implied consent there of her and Eric and the sexual intercourse that came from that. Again, that ultimate control that men wielded over women at that time, because it was expected that the woman was to do what the man had proposed. That was the power that the male had over the female at the time. Again, rooted back in these Victorian values. And also that concept that the women are shallow creatures and they're both judged and driven by looks and superficial values. So at the beginning, everybody comments on Eva Smith's good looks, and also when Sheila's getting questioned, she explains about how well, how nice Eva Smith looked in the dress, and she actually felt that she was being judged of how she looked when she tried on that dress, and actually she then wanted to get Eva Smith fired. So yeah, even though further in the play there is still this, Sheila still shows these early signs of this feminist movement, that she questions Gerald, she questions her father. Actually at the start, she's still this shallow creature, and that she's driven by looks and these superficial values. Okay, so I hope you found that insightful. As always, if there are any questions, any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. I will endeavour to answer all questions that are asked. And again, a final thank you to Nikki Smith for providing this PowerPoint and for the fantastic insight that you provided at the CPD.